All right. Well, we're wrapping up with a rather unpleasant subject, but I promise you that we'll talk about the implications of the gospel at the end, so it will end on a more glorious note than the dark subject matter that we're about to enter into. But, you know, Justin was talking about ancient Near Eastern deities and the relationship of the Israelites in dealing with Canaanite culture and other ancient Near Eastern mythologies and deities and all the complexities that went along with that and the challenges that were associated with that, and how it really took the destruction of Jerusalem to finally purge the Israelite community of that type of idolatry. I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of mixing or adopting these Canaanite cultic practices with the worship of God, that the Israelites fell into a terrible, terrible trap after entering into Canaan and engaging with the Canaanite culture, in part because they didn't fully obey God in terms of getting the Canaanites out, and a variety of other influences. I think you'll find this subject dark and fascinating. From the archaeological standpoint, there's been a lot of evidence uncovered that affirms what the biblical texts talk about here. And so we're going to walk through that, and we'll talk about all the different pieces of evidence. We've done quite a bit of research on this subject because of its modern-day implications and its connection with the practice of abortion. And our ministry holds a position that it's the same spirit that influences both of these terrible things as it deals with the unborn or the soon thereafter born. So let's roll with it. The first thing we'll talk about is just a couple of biblical texts. Here we have Deuteronomy 12, and this is a warning from the Lord to the Israelites not to get ensnared in the cultic practices of the Canaanites. Do not do various things. Don't serve the gods in the same way, etc., etc. You see this in multiple verses prior to the conquest. God issuing warnings in advance to the leaders of Israel and to the Israelite people in general. The part we're going to focus on is this last part of the phrase that God says that He hates what they do for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire. And we're going to talk about what that means and what the context of that is. So that's one verse. We go all the way down, fast forward 700 years to the time of Jeremiah, and we find the Israelites have not only engaged in this practice or melded it into their worship of the Lord, but they're actually still partaking in this practice centuries later. And here is from the prophet Jeremiah. Now, all that's left is the kingdom of Judah, after many centuries of apostasy and idolatry. And God brings an accusation to them. They have built the high places of the Tophet, and I'll explain that to you in a moment, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom. If you recall from where the Silver Scrolls were discovered, that's the same valley, it's the Hinnom Valley, Ketef Hinnom scrolls, same area. And they burn their sons and their daughters in the fire. And then here, 2 Kings, they burn their sons and their daughters as offerings and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking God to anger. We see this expression often in the Old Testament. And a fascinating verse in the book of Psalms, God, in the way the Hebrew text is written, it actually is a parallelism. They sacrificed their sons and daughters not to Canaanite deities, but to demons. And this word shed or shade, depending on how you pronounce it, is only used 3 times in the Old Testament. We see demons referred to many, many times in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, only 3 times. And in reference to child sacrifice, 2 out of the 3. And then it's parallel. They sacrificed their sons and daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, who they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And of course the Apostle Paul tells us that whatever pagan sacrifice they sacrifice and offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. So we see the full revelation of this coming out in the New Testament as well. Ultimately, the influence behind all of these pagan idols is demonic activity in the ultimate sense, deceiving men and women to, unfortunately, kill their young children and sacrifice to a pagan god. Now, one more verse I want to share with you. This is one of the first commands in Leviticus prohibiting this practice. A couple of quick things that you haven't seen mentioned so far is a mention of Molech. Okay, and this is a particular reference always in the context of child sacrifice. Shall surely be put to death. I will set my face against him if he does so. And anyone who closes their eyes to this practice, so not only someone who does it, someone who ignores it. God is very serious about this. And it's also mentioned in Leviticus 18. So there's a variety of what you would call formulas in the Old Testament that describe it, loving the sons and daughters.
You just read that last one.
Say again?
You just read that last one.
You did. Okay. The Tophet, Molech, a variety of different ways that the biblical authors describe it, but it's all pointing to the same practice. And the reason why, in part, I show you this is because what's fascinating is I went on the Dead Sea Scrolls website when the digital Dead Sea Scrolls were first rolled out, and what do you know, on the first page they have a fragment of Leviticus 20 which has the ban on Molech child sacrifice. And so I printed it out and looked at the text, and I found that right here is the reference to Molech, and I was able to sort of go through it. Here it is again, to Molech. I don't know how to read Paleo-Hebrew, so I went to a website and printed it off and compared it to the regular Hebrew and spent about an hour doing that. It was a lot of fun. But there is, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, a fragment of Leviticus 20 that's been discovered, and from about the time of Jesus this was written. So, fascinating. From the archaeological record, here's a couple places where it says to Molech, just to show you. And then here's an infrared of it, so you can see the lettering a little bit better. Here and here are the references, and then there's other parts of the text that are there as well. So, some pretty fascinating stuff. There it is again, to Molech. All right, so let's talk about some geography. The Canaanites were, of course, in Israel proper, which you see over here. This is more of a biblical map. But they were also north of Israel, up in this area, Tyre and Sidon. And here's a parallel map that kind of focuses on this area. The people that lived here were Canaanite, but they became known as the Phoenicians. You'll read about the Phoenicians. That's the name that was given to them by the Greeks and the Romans. They didn't call themselves Phoenicians. They called themselves Canaanite. We refer to them as Phoenicians, as modern-day historians. And so you see various sites you've probably heard of, Tyre and Sidon and so forth. And so that's who we're going to be talking about here. So the Israelites come into the land and they meld some of the practices. The Canaanite culture continues on. They really become prominent in the more northern area, north of Israel, up into Syria. And they begin to colonize the Mediterranean Sea. They go all the way over to North Africa, which is about 1,400 miles away. And they have various settlements that they have in the region of North Africa. And one of the places that they settle at is the city of Carthage, which is in the tip of North Africa in modern-day Tunisia.
Who was this that went?
This is the Canaanites.
The Canaanites, okay.
This is what I was just talking about.
Okay.
Known as the Phoenicians to us. If you read about the Phoenicians, they are of Canaanite origin. And they were colonizers. So they spread out all across the Mediterranean, and they landed colonies in the western Mediterranean. So even though this is 1,400 miles from Israel, the Canaanite culture went with them. Follow me? They brought their cultural practices with them when they spread across the Mediterranean, and they settled at Carthage and spread across the area. And one of the things that they did at Carthage that they brought with them was the practice of child sacrifice. And Carthage has been excavated an extraordinary amount. And here's a picture of funerary stela. These are like tombstones, you would call them today. They've been excavated over numerous decades at Carthage. And the Carthaginians worship these two deities called Tanit Ashtar and Baal Haman. And you recognize the Baal, which Justin talked about. And you might remember the Ashtoreths of the Old Testament. So there's a relationship here. The names are a little bit different, but you can see very close similarities. And these are inscribed on these funerary stelae that I just showed you here, over and over and over and over again. And here's another picture of them. They have distinctive Canaanite origins. Tanit is depicted below with the triangle, the hands out to the side, and Baal Haman is the moon at the top, represented by a disc and a crescent. And he was her consort in the Canaanite pantheon, if you will. And here we have a mention in Judges 6 connecting the Baals and the Ashtoreth together. So clearly the biblical authors are familiar with this. The Canaanites take their culture across the Mediterranean, and they keep a lot of their cultural traditions as they go out and travel across and colonize. Here's another picture of one, and there's hundreds of them. Here's one from the 2nd century. This one's in excellent condition. This is the British Museum. You can see the double depiction of Tanit with the triangles in the hand, and then here we have the crescent moon, which is Baal Haman. And then these were set up over burial urns. So you have these funerary stela, and then underneath you would find this burial urn. And when the archaeologists uncovered them, they found the scorched and charred remains of small children in the burial urn. And then the inscription explains here, this is a sacrifice given to Baal Haman and Tanit Ashtar, and I'll show you a couple of those examples. This is from the British Museum, and this is a Canaanite script written down here. So very, very similar, even though it's far away. And here's a particular inscription: to Our Lady Tanit and to our Lord Baal Haman, to that which was vowed. And what was vowed is the small child in the burial urn underneath the stela. And there's been thousands of these discovered at Carthage. There's a number of reasons why we know that these are not just normal infant deaths, because these are live sacrifices. The sacrifice doesn't take place unless it's a live sacrifice. Imagine sacrificing a dead sheep to a pagan deity. It would have no meaning. A sacrifice has to be something that's alive. And so, in this case, we find the archaeologists found hundreds, thousands, and thousands and thousands of urns with the remains of infants buried underneath these funeral stela. Extensive research has been done looking at the remains. The age range is very small. By looking at the tooth remains, the dental remains, about a month to a month and a half is a large majority of them, which would go against the theory that it's just a regular cemetery, because you would find a more wide range of ages. It's not the only ages, but it's the primary profile of the ages. The archaeologist that excavated here, primarily a guy from Harvard, has done extensive research on the remains to be sure that it indeed is sacrifice and not just a regular cemetery, because we know that infant mortality in the ancient world was rather high. Here's another stela, limestone, and you can see the upraised hands, a little different style here. Instead of coming out the side of the triangular representation, it's just one hand on the side, raised up like this. So, you see a variety of different stylistic ways that they portray these two gods. But nonetheless, and here's the crescent moon at the top, you can see once again. So you can see they morph and change over time, but the general idea is there over many centuries. Here's a burial urn. I think that's 5th century BC from Carthage. Here's 7th century BC urn showing the charred remains of an infant found under funerary stela. And so the question is, we know that the Phoenicians traveled across the Mediterranean all the way to North Africa, but do we have some evidence back in the homeland, if you will? It's a little closer to Israel to kind of bring the connections closer together. We don't have what is called a tophet, and a tophet is described in the Old Testament. It can be translated as roaster or place of burning, and this is what modern scholars call these places where they believe child sacrifice took place. They call it a tophet. And you see God's condemnation of what was called the tophet in the Old Testament. We have not found one in the mainland. The archaeologists have not found one. But we have evidence tying these deities together from Carthage to the mainland, and I want to show you a little bit of that. Another part of evidence that we have is ancient authors testifying to what was going on in Carthage. Here's a Greek author from the 3rd century saying whenever they seek to obtain some great favor, they vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice to the deity if they are especially eager to gain success. And there's a number of different ancient authors that testify to that the Carthaginians were doing this, and a number of them. And you see how they distinguish the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians. So clearly this author is familiar with Carthage and the Phoenician homeland, and even though it's the same culture, he's distinguishing between the two of them. So apparently he believed that it was taking place on the mainland as well. And just to give you an idea, to go back, now we're going to go back to Phoenicia. In this area here, we're just going to talk quickly about a discovery about right in that area at Sarepta, which is just north of Tyre. And this is a inscription found at Zarephath, which is the place where Elijah raised the widow's son from the dead. And this is an ivory plaque discovered in the 1970s, which mentions Tanit Ashtar, and it was the oldest reference to that point in time discovered, and it was in a shrine with cultic objects dedicated to Tanit and Ashtar, and it actually mentions Tanit Ashtar by name, and was reported by our own Dr. Wood in the 1975 issue of Bible and Spade when I was in kindergarten. And but this makes a connection in the homeland, this Tanit Ashtar deity, to the Carthaginian location all the way across the Mediterranean. This is a significant discovery. Ironic that here we have this mention of this deity that is responsible for the sacrifice of children in the very same place where the God of life raises the widow's son from the dead. And so we see the portrayal of paganism versus the power of life given by the infinite, incorruptible God. So
The Canaanite woman? Is that the one we're talking about? His dead son? The prophet Elisha?
Elijah, yeah. Yeah, he visits her house and he
lays out on
her. Raises him from the dead.
Canaanite woman, yeah.
At Zarephath.
Okay.
Is where this takes place. So it's kind of ironic, another irony of history, another wink from God. We were talking about that before, wink from God, if you want to interpret it that way. Now we're going to go back to Hatzor. You guys remember we talked about Hatzor a number of times. Justin mentioned an archaeologist named Yigal Yadin, who excavated Hatzor in the 1950s, and he found a late bronze stela. This is the oldest depiction that's ever been discovered, as far as I know, of the hands and the crescent moon at Hatzor. This is very ancient. This is the time of Joshua. This is going way back. And this iconographic figure looks very similar to the ones found at Carthage. And Yadin made that connection, and he made that argument in his scholarly work as it relates to his excavation. This is really powerful evidence connecting these deities between Israel proper and all the way across the Mediterranean Sea. And very ancient. So it also is an affirmation of the biblical text. God telling the Israelites before they go into the land, do not do what the Canaanites do to their children. Do not fall into this trap. I'm warning you, do not provoke the Lord's anger. And this is a powerful affirmation of that historical reality. It must have been taking place in Canaan at that time, making another really powerful connection. And here's just a description of it, dated to late Bronze 1, and the crescent moon and the hands going up to the sky. I think it's a pretty obvious connection. There's been, again, I've told you many times, there's always some scholar you can find that disagrees with it, but sometimes the straightforward answer is the simple answer is probably the right one. So put together the case, and there you go. There you see the upraised hands, just to compare 1400 BC to 400 BC. So 1,000 years later, we still see the same kind of depiction being found in Canaanite culture. Really persistent in the cultural practice. And there's the hand again. And so we can wrap this up. The implications of this, I think, are obvious for us as Christians who are sensitive to the admonition by God to protect human life. That God gives very strict circumstances where human life can be taken, and certainly in sacrificing children to pagan gods is not one of them. But this gentleman here, I think, in some ways, speaks well to the issue. He's a scholar that did his PhD dissertation on this subject and excavated at Carthage. And I'll read this to you. It's impossible to deal with this subject at any length without coming to terms with the human dimension. How could a culture so well developed morally, intellectually, and materially tolerate so abominable a custom? And the Carthaginians were a very advanced culture. And the more advanced they became, the more they sacrificed their children. That's what the archaeological evidence seems to indicate. How could such a sophisticated people sanction what seems to be such a barbaric practice for such a long period of time? How, at the most visceral and critical level, could human beings bring about the destruction of their own child? This is a question he asks at the end of his dissertation. Very powerful impact that it had on him, the study of such a thing. And then a Christian scholar who also excavated at Carthage puts it this way, and puts a challenge to us, I think, in our modern day, because there are many parallels between the practice of abortion in our modern society and this practice. A lot of the rationale and reasoning that people gave to sacrifice their children are the same kind of rationales that are used today. And we can't get into those parallels. If you go on our website and type this in, you can read a couple of articles that spell out the parallels and kind of make some connections. Some of the same kind of reasoning used for both practices, and how the early church condemned the practice of abortion. We find that in writings, extra-biblical writings in the early church. They were familiar with the practice going on, the killing of infants and killing them in the womb as well. But John Currid says, all the societies I've studied, primitive cultures have little evidence of abortion or infanticide. They are primarily the practices of the higher cultures of antiquity. I suppose we would think of ourselves as a higher culture of modern day, wouldn't we? It seems to me the only enlightening difference between our societies and Carthage is that we sanitize the process. We don't offer our children to idols. We destroy them in the hospital. Our sacrifices of convenience without any facade of religious motivation. In truth, we are merely unmasked Carthaginians. Wow, it's pretty powerful stuff. And so, it's a warning to us. Obviously, our primary duty is to propagate the gospel in terms of being members of the church. And but we also live in a larger society that we ought to try to endorse society to not do such things that God seriously hates and condemns. And so I would encourage us to pray for our country. Yes?
It's certainly appropriate to talk about this, particularly this week, with it being the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. This week right now.
Yeah, that's right. What was that, Tuesday?
Yeah.
Was the 40th anniversary? And we brought this research out about a year ago, so it was around the 39th anniversary that we did it. Yeah, very, very appropriate. And just for us to be praying for the church to demand righteousness from ourselves, but to influence the culture with the gospel, to hopefully have a change of heart and mind. And so, one of the most powerful images that I've ever seen is this Carthaginian priest with this child under his arm, clearly taking this child off to be sacrificed to a pagan god. It's very, very heartbreaking, very sobering. And so, archaeology tells us a lot. It reveals to us a lot. We've talked about a lot of different things in our time together here over the last 2 days. There's a human dimension to it too. It speaks of people and places and practices and times and the fallenness and wickedness of the human heart in its fallen state and need for the gospel. And so, today we can make the same kind of rationalizations that the Carthaginians and the Canaanites made as a culture. And so I want to encourage you to pray for the church and pray for our country to turn from it, because God seriously hates and condemns it.